Welcome back, everybody, to the Cold War, 13.3. Why did America fail, quote unquote, in Korea and Vietnam? So this is part two. We're going to be dealing with the Vietnam War, maybe America's biggest nightmare, at least up until the 21st century. Now, when you look at this slide, a couple things should stand out. First and foremost, more than anything else, you should be looking at that time period. 1953 to 1975. That's a 22-year war. Now, was America really at war for 22 years? Well, that's going to depend on your definition of war. For the most part, most people would say no, but it's a long time. It's a long time to be involved in something. And the next thing we remember about Vietnam is very few names in American history resonate with failure like Vietnam. You know, it's a negative. You know, people refer to the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan as their Vietnam. In other words, recognizing just how much America struggled. One way to think about it is there's an old story about a rabbit, Brer Rabbit, and Brer Fox wanted to capture Brer Rabbit. And to capture Brer Rabbit, he built himself a tar baby, a little baby, you know, looked like a baby, arms and legs, a face, button eyes, dressed it up in a hat and a coat. And Brer Rabbit hopped by and saw the tar baby and said hello to the tar baby. Tar baby wouldn't say hello back. So Brer Rabbit decided to teach him some manners and punched him. Well, as soon as Brer Rabbit punched him, he got his fist stuck in that tar. He said, "You need to let me go, tar baby, or I'm going to hit you with another fist." Well, of course, tar baby didn't let him go, so Brer Rabbit hit him with another fist. Now both his fists were stuck. He said, "You better let me go, or I'm going to kick you." Of course, tar baby didn't let him go, so Brer Rabbit kicked him. Next thing you know, Brer Rabbit is covered in tar. Well, you might think of the United States and Vietnam in the same kind of manner. You know, Brer Rabbit is cocky, conceited, happy-go-lucky United States, and sitting there on a log is Vietnam, just waiting for us to get all messed up in it. So let's start to break down what happened in the Vietnam War. If you look over here on the side, you'll see a map. It should look almost identical to a map we just looked at in the beginning of 13.3. You got North Vietnam, just like you have North Korea, right up next to China. And then you've got South Vietnam, kind of like a South Korea. And these two countries had divided after fighting, I guess you could call it a civil war. The French had colonized and controlled Vietnam for many a year, kind of like the United States for the Philippines. Remember Emilio Aguinaldo? Well, there, Emilio Aguinaldo was a fellow by the name of Ho Chi Minh. You see him right there. He was a nationalist who wanted Vietnamese independence from France. He had converted to communism when he read some Lenin ideology talking about, you know, that these countries should be free. And so they fought for quite a while to get rid of French influence. Well, France finally just said enough with it and left. But we were now concerned with something that people began to discuss called the domino theory. And the domino theory was basically this. You have all these countries in Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. Now, we didn't care a whole lot about those countries, but we sure did care about India. And that's a big country. And the fear was if one of these countries fell to communism, there he is, Mr. Viet Cong, if one of them became communist, then the rest would domino fall to communism. Well, that goes against what strategy that the United States has in terms of dealing with communism. It goes against our containment. And so we go to Indochina, also known as Vietnam. Now, the first way we go is with Dwight Eisenhower sending money. So the first punch to the tar baby is a cash check. You can see this is Diem. That's the South Vietnamese president. Notice how he's trying to look like a European, like a Western, like an American. Same clothes, same hair, probably had the same car, same mistress. You know, these South Vietnamese politicians love the money we gave them. And they actually became a little corrupt, which is going to cause some problems later. But that wasn't enough. the communist influence was growing. And so our next president, John F. Kennedy, in the early 60s, began to send advisors. Advisors like this fella here or this fella here. These are Green Berets, Secret Service, Secret Special Forces, American soldiers who are trying to teach the South Vietnamese how to fight. We taught them how to look like John Wayne. Now we got to teach them how to fight like John Wayne. And so we didn't want to send the whole army. We didn't want to commit too much. But yet there's another punch into the tar baby. So we're in Southeast Asia now. Well, we don't know what Kennedy would have done because Kennedy, of course, is assassinated in 1963. And that leads his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to take over. And Lyndon Baines Johnson was no softy. And he was definitely wants to, fight and contain communism. And so he's going to escalate the war. Now, there's something referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The USS Maddox, this boat here, was, if you look at the map, here's the border at the 17th parallel between North and South Vietnam. So north up here. The USS Maddox was up in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, it's not really that hard to tell. This is their backyard. And if my dog was taking a dump in your backyard and you hit my dog with a stick, well, there's not much I can say about that. My dog was in your yard taking a dump. Well, here's the USS Maddox running around in North Vietnam's backyard, and they shoot at it. Well, LBJ, of course, acts all indignant and says, we need to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically says I can send troops into Vietnam. It was not a formal declaration of war. It was an executive act. Think about your separation of powers, your executive orders. Remember FDR's executive order, which interned the Japanese Americans. Andrew Jackson used an executive order to create the pet banks. So here's LBJ using his executive order to basically commit American troops to war. Later on, we'll find out that he was lying about a lot of this, but we'll get to that later. So what does it look like as we get involved in the war? So we attack North Vietnam and the group we called the VC, the Viet Cong, that were running amongst in South Vietnam. Well, this is called Americanization. Now, what do the Americans do when they want to win a war? We mobilize. We crank up the industry. We overwhelm with superiority. And if you look at this picture, you can see just fields upon fields of these round canisters. These are artillery shells. Think about how many artillery shells must have been shot to get just this empty field of the extras. You can see this graph here, what's the number one thing that jumps out of the graph? Holy smokes, that line goes up really high. Well, starting in 1964, midway, this is LBJ's presidency, look at the number of American men going to Vietnam, all the way up to almost 600,000. Okay. Well, anytime you put lots of soldiers, Americanization into war, lots of soldiers are going to get attacked, they're going to get hurt, they're going to get wounded. So we're basically at war now. Well, we upgrade the war with what we referred to as Operation Rolling Thunder. Okay, how did we win World War II? Well, we bombed the German factories into submission. We island hopped till we got close enough to Japan to bomb Japan and, finally used the one big bomb to finish things off. But, what's the American strategy? Bomb factories, bomb bridges, bomb railroads, take away their ability to fight a war. Well, that works great in the industrialized nations in Europe, in the industrialized nation of Japan, relatively. Doesn't work so well when you're talking about a jungle, remote third world nation where most people, rely on subsistence agriculture. We actually dropped more bombs in Vietnam than we did in all of World War II. And it wasn't super effective. We had actually gone into this war, this Americanized war, with the idea that we were going to win the hearts of the South Vietnamese people and help them to want to fight for themselves, to fight against communism. Well, when you're dropping bombs on South Vietnamese villages, and some of those bombs are what are referred to have napalm in it, Napalm is like weed killer with fire and steroids. It's a nasty little deal. And this is a very famous image of a girl running from her South Vietnamese village after it had been hit by American napalm. That wasn't necessarily the target, but it wasn't not the target either. Pretty amazing story if you do some research on this girl. She ended up living a pretty amazing life. Regardless, our strategy of Americanization and Rolling Thunder was met with guerrilla war. So the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the communists fighting both in the North and in the South, decided, well, they'll never defeat the big, huge United States. Look at U.S. power here, this huge left-handed picture. But way down here, you can see they got a tiny little strike zone. It's going to be hard for us to strike those guys out, especially when you think that they're willing to fight underground. They had tunnels throughout Vietnam. You could see some soldiers here, reaching down into these tunnels, and you would have to get down in here and sneak. They've got first aid station, ammunition, they've got a kitchen. They would pop up, pop out. The Viet Cong were tremendous at fighting a warfare where basically their number one strategy, stop me when this sounds familiar, was to wear out the larger aggressor nation by fighting small battles and ensuring that they would never lose a big battle, never engage them to a way that you would lose, in the hopes that eventually the larger power would eventually tire of trying to fight and go home. Well, that should sound familiar twice. It worked for America when George Washington employed that same strategy, and the British finally got tired of fighting and went home. And the South tried that strategy, although Lee violated it when he went into the North twice, most notably at Gettysburg. Some other things that go along with this guerrilla war: it was very difficult for American troops to find the enemy. You can see an American soldier here pushing an elderly gentleman through a village. What would happen in some of these villages is the VC would either by force or with cooperation use the village as a hiding place for their weapons or their food. The villagers would either not tell the American soldiers where the Viet Cong were, or they wouldn't tell them because they were scared. So the American soldiers would come through, search the village, find weapons, be angry at the villagers. The villagers are like, well, they told us if we didn't keep them, they'd kill us. Or maybe they kept them because they wanted to. It was a harsh, difficult war. You can see another very famous image here. This is a South Vietnamese chief of police who is moments away from executing this VC member who had just executed a lieutenant colonel in the South Vietnamese army, his family, his children, and his 80-year-old mother. So when you're taking pictures of people executing people who have executed 80-year-olds, it's a tough, difficult war. And it was very hard for the United States to use our Operation Rolling Thunder and Americanization to win this guerrilla war. So things are struggling, and it escalates into basically what we would call a quagmire. Okay. We had a 5-line conversation between Ho Chi Minh and George Washington about how their strategies were going to be used to win a war. Moving on, the war starts to become very unpopular. You have people protesting, we won't fight another rich man's war, which is very ironic because there wasn't much necessarily about the war itself. But what happened is people could get deferments, meaning you don't have to be drafted if you went to college. Well, college was seen as a rich man's activity. And so here you have rich men, poor men, okay? Silent vigil to express our sorrow and our protest till Americans stop being killed and stop killing. Walk with us for peace in Vietnam. People really began to speak to their government about wanting to be out of Vietnam. People started to refer to it as a quagmire. Quagmire is kind of like that bit stuck with the tar baby. And one reason why this war became very unpopular was people were able to watch it on TV. In some ways, it was the first war that was televised. This is a famous American broadcaster named Walter Cronkite, who, with helmet and camera, would broadcast images from the war. And these aren't successful images. These are images of American soldiers being wounded, struggling. You've got these pictures coming back of executions and little girls. People really started to question, was containment worth it? Remember, we had gotten into this war because we wanted to stop communism from spreading. It worked in Korea, and we've lost China, and we're scared with the domino theory. So maybe our motives were good in terms of the Cold War, but the execution was pretty poor, and we're losing, and it's not going well. And Americans are starting to ask, is it worth the cost, both in terms of money and in life? Well, it did cost something. It cost LBJ a lot of his support. Probably the final nail in the coffin was the Tet Offensive, probably the turning point in the Vietnam War. Think of it as their surprise attack, maybe like Washington crossing the Delaware or Pearl Harbor. Basically what had happened is around the Chinese New Year, the North Vietnamese had said, we'll take a truce. We won't fight. Ceasefire during the holiday. But as you notice, all of these red stars are Vietnamese Viet Cong attacks in South Vietnam, basically all coordinated at the same time. Now, none of those individual attacks was super effective, but the ability to coordinate that many attacks all at the same time pretty much proved that Uncle Sam was up to his neck in it in Vietnam. And the Tet Offensive, while not a military success, was a success in basically showing that we probably aren't going to win this war. And as a result of that, LBJ loses when he tries to be renominated by his party. He basically says, I'm out. I'm not even going to try and run for president. I will not accept. And so, as a result of that, a Republican, Richard Nixon, wins the war, basically promising to end the war at Vietnam. That might remind you of Woodrow Wilson. He kept us out of war. So you can see here in 1968, the Republicans win a pretty split election. Notice there's a third party. This is George Wallace, the racist bigot. You can see where he's getting all of his votes. We'll talk more about him in the civil rights movement. Another thing that made this interesting is the Democratic Convention of '68, where they were trying to choose their own president, led to riot after riot. They were fighting themselves trying to choose a president. That's where America was in terms of being divided during this time period. But Nixon is elected president, and his promise is going to be ending the war. So we try what's referred to as the Vietnamization. And what is the Vietnamization? Well, basically we leave. We give a bunch of guns and helicopters and grenades to these Vietnamese troops and leave them there to protect South Vietnam. Well, what does the North Vietnamese Viet Cong think about the South Vietnamese troops? Obviously, they're not too scared. And we don't really know, as you can see here, if Vietnamization is going to work. And in the midst of that, we realize, or Nixon realizes, that many of the attacks that have been happening in Vietnam, now it's kind of tough here to see, but this is Vietnam running down the edge of the map. Notice it runs right next to Laos, this kind of, looks maybe like a fly swatter country, and then Cambodia here. Well, the Vietnamese had been going through what they called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went through Laos, through Cambodia, down into South Vietnam. Well, Nixon decided that the only way for us to stop these attacks from coming through Laos and Cambodia is to attack Laos and Cambodia. So remember, his promise was, I'm going to end the war, we're going to Vietnamize the war, and next thing you know, we're bombing Laos and Cambodia, and he wasn't super honest about it, and things got worse. Cambodia, as you can see here, where all the bombs hit, became an absolute train wreck of a nation. And their dictator, Pol Pot, you can see his quote here, better to kill an innocent by mistake than spare an enemy by mistake, killed about a fourth of the population of Cambodia. His group was referred to as the Khmer Rouge. Rouge is in red, as in communist. They referred to it as the killing fields. And here's this author who basically said, what the American government started by bombing Cambodia and turning the people against the United States, Pol Pot completed by taking over the country and executing thousands. So we've promised to end the war, to Vietnamize the war, and we've expanded the war and turned loose a dictator. That's when the protests hit their fever pitch. You know, here's a young guy burning his draft card saying, I refuse to go to war. Remember we talked about World War II where there were incidents of suicides because they were not allowed to volunteer? Now we're burning our draft cards. There was a protest of the war at Kent State University in Ohio, and some young National Guardsmen got a little nervous and pulled the trigger. And you can see this young lady crying out because this student has just been shot and killed by an American. They referred to it as the Kent State Massacre. Protest after protest. They referred to them as hawks versus doves. You know, here's this, I don't give a damn for Uncle Sam. I ain't going to Vietnam. Some people left America, went to Canada, went to other places, basically as a way of saying, we refuse to fight. Soldiers would come home and be spit on. They were called baby killers. It was an incredibly negative time in America. You could see some more of the images, etc. But it hit its worst moments first with the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were basically LBJ's lies about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the way we had gotten into the war, that shows that we had picked a fight with North Vietnam, inserted American troops without really telling the American people what we're going to do. And America really did not trust the government moving forward. Shortly, we're going to be talking about Watergate and how it made that worse. And then the My Lai incident came out. My Lai was a Vietnamese village where some American troops went in. It gets a little fuzzy here, but basically the American troops were sent in with the orders to rough this place up a little bit. It was in an area of known Viet Cong establishment. And so these troops, led by this Lieutenant William Calley, here he is here, went into the village and ended up executing hundreds of women, children, and the elderly. It was America at its worst. You know, here's the My Lai ditch claims another victim. Aside from all the dead South Vietnamese, that's our U.S. conscience. You know, and it became a huge moment as America realized what was going on. You know, here were these American soldiers. Why would they shoot and kill women and children? Well, the frustration for these soldiers who are used to going into a village, cleaning out the village, and then being attacked from behind from the village. Again, the villagers could have been innocent, or they could have partake. It just depended. The Viet Cong were very ruthless in dealing with these villagers at times. It was just hard. And these American soldiers were frustrated. They were strung out, and they executed them. And a big part of it was, well, who's at fault? Is it Lieutenant Calley who's at fault? Or was it his superiors who told him to go in there? Was it the sergeant who pulled the trigger? And America's conscience took a hit as we realized that our morality in the Vietnam War was not like it had been in previous wars. 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the Vietnamese. And you can see a very famous image here. You know, it made the Washington Post. This is the last group of people trying to get on the last helicopter. You can see so many people trying to get on the helicopter. Here's this American actually throwing a punch so that the helicopter can take off. Looks like this guy, this Vietnamese, is trying to help his friend, because many of these South Vietnamese people know that when the North Vietnamese bust through the fences, they're going to be the ones in trouble because they collaborated with the enemy. You know, there were stories after World War II of French women being shaved, having their heads shaved because they had gotten too cozy to German officers. There were rumors that little babies in Saigon, that maybe their eyes were a little too blue or their skin a little too light because maybe they had connected with some American soldiers, or maybe their hair was a little curly like an African American soldier, that the North Vietnamese were going to take these babies and execute them. Well, that didn't happen, but man, was there a lot of fear, as you can see in these people's faces here. But this is America at its lowest. We are running out of Vietnam with our tail between our legs as we flee at the last second. And that pretty much ended the Vietnam War. Now, there's some questions as to whether we ever could have won the Vietnam War. So take a minute and discuss. Think about why and why not Vietnam was a winnable war. Last thing we want to discuss are some long-term effects. Pretty soon after this time period, Congress passes something called the War Powers Act, which basically said no more presidents shoving us into wars. And in general, basically what it says is, President, if you want to put people in war, you got about 40 days. After that, if Congress doesn't declare war, troops are coming home. So we did limit the power of the president to put us into war. Second, money. Oh my goodness, money, money, money. We started spending millions on this war, and it cost us. You know, LBJ had a great program to kind of help America in the 60s called the Great Society. Couldn't pay for it. All the money went to Vietnam. Of course, all of the protests, the hippies, peace. There's a lot of things people were protesting during the 60s. Civil rights, feminism, gay rights, environment, but Vietnam was probably number one. And maybe last of and most important of any other was the fear of another Vietnam. American politicians don't think about going anywhere in the world in terms of foreign policy without asking themselves, oh, geez, is this going to be another Vietnam? We asked it in Iraq. We asked it in Afghanistan. We asked it in Rwanda, in Bosnia. We're asking it in Syria. You know, America has this intense desire to not repeat a mistake. So that ends a very long lesson on the Vietnam War.